I want to begin by sharing with you a story about a place that I'm sure you've heard of. It was a place in North Vietnam that was a place of brutal torture of many American soldiers. The place I'm referring to is the Hanoi Hilton. Some of you probably have heard of it. Not only were our American pilots locked in cells and kept there for many years, but they were also brutally, mentally and physically tortured for many years. You may have heard of some of these POWs. Many of them are famous Americans, such as Senator John McCain, Admiral Jim Stockdale. There's one that lives in Tupelo, Mississippi, that's a member of First United Methodist Church. His name is Smitty Harris. And this morning, following our early service, someone said there's another of these POWs that lives in West Point. And later in the service, I'm going to tell you a story of one by the name of Red McDaniel. Admiral Stockdale was the ranking member of the group of POWs at the Hanoi Hilton, and he is the one that's responsible for creating the culture that has been written about in a lot of different books that sustain these POWs during this brutal time in their lives. Many of the lessons that we learned from his leadership are talked about in the book Lessons from Hanoi Hilton, and it's a book that was published back in 2013. It describes how men who suffered years of brutal torture in this environment, this prison, how they could emerge to become many of our nation's outstanding leaders. Out of the Hanoi Hilton came 16 generals, 6 admirals, 2 U.S. ambassadors, 2 U.S. senators, 2 U.S. representatives, a state governor, a presidential candidate, and several other state legislators, doctors, lawyers, company CEOs, and the list goes on and on. And when we think about their experience and how they were subjected to all this brutal mistreatment for all these years, today we hear of soldiers coming home from POW experiences, and many of them have PTSD, and they struggle with those experiences for the remainder of their lives. But how could these men return home and seem spared those types of experiences? How is that possible? How can a hellhole like the Hanoi Hilton become a leadership training ground for so many of our nation's leaders? Well, it was largely in part due to Admiral Jim Stockdale and the culture that he brought through his leadership. It was a culture that emphasized community, and it emphasized trust in one another. He also helped to develop the communication that the prisoners did, the TAP code that we've heard so much about, a way of these prisoners communicating through their cells. And he also brought a sense of mission and purpose in the midst of very desperate times. And I learned in reading some of this book and in this experience that there's a lesson for us, and I think relates to the experience of the Israelites that we're about to look at. The lesson is this: you can't choose the circumstances that happen to you, but you can choose how you will respond to them. Much of life throws at us circumstances we don't have any control over, but what we do have control over is how we're going to respond in the midst of those circumstances. And y'all, this will become a prominent theme as we look at Exodus and transition to part 2 of our sermon series that we're going to be spending the next 3 weeks. These middle chapters, 15 through 18, highlight for us Israel's journey through the desert, through the wilderness. In Exodus 15:22, we find the turning point. The Israelites have come out of bondage in Egypt, and we read this. It says, "Then Moses made Israel set out from the Red Sea, and they went into the wilderness." Now here's where we are in the storyline. So God has dramatically delivered the Israelites from slavery. We know how they put the blood over the doors of their homes and they were spared the wrath of God that came upon the Egyptians. And they were led into this freedom. But as they're traveling, as they're leaving Egypt, they come against the Red Sea. And Trey, a few weeks ago, talked to us about how God's power and majesty were displayed in that event of the parting of the waters. And Pharaoh and the army are drowned. And God leads His people out. And God promises to lead them to a new homeland, to the land of milk and honey. And so God leads them out. And now Israel enters into their promised land, right? No. They don't go into the promised land immediately. Immediately, we're told they go into the wilderness. Are they lost? Have they taken a wrong turn? What's going on? We ask, what's happening? We thought that God had promised to lead them to the land flowing with milk and honey, but instead they go to a desolate, dry and barren, God-forsaken land, the desert, the wilderness. What's happening? Well, we are assured in the story that God hasn't abandoned the people, that they haven't taken a wrong turn, that they're not lost, that God is in fact continuing to guide their steps. He's leading the way in the pillar of cloud and fire. God's presence is guiding them, and they're right where they're supposed to be. Well, what's going on in this story? Why are these people being led into this wilderness? Well, to understand that question, we have to look further at another passage of Scripture in Deuteronomy chapter 8, where we find Moses is leading the people. They've been in the wilderness for 40 years, and they're about to enter into the promised land. Finally, eventually, they make it to the borders of the promised land. Nothing between the promised land and them but the Jordan River. And we know from the story that Moses isn't allowed to enter into the promised land with the people. And so he's given them a final speech. He's motivating them as they go into the land. And he says this to them in Deuteronomy chapter 8, verses 2 and 3. He says, "Remember the long way that the Lord your God has led you these 40 years in the wilderness, in order to humble you, to test you, to know what was in your heart, whether or not you would keep His commandments. He humbled you by letting you hunger and then feeding you with manna, with which neither you nor your ancestors were acquainted, in order to make you understand that one does not live off of bread alone, but every word that comes from the mouth of the Lord." And so here we find Moses reminding them, reflecting back on these 40 years of why God has led them through this wilderness. It says that the wilderness was a place to humble them, to teach them humility. It was a place that also teaches us the value of testing, of how we need to have our faith refined and tested through the trials of life, the difficult circumstances. And Moses also tells them that it was to be a time where they would learn to live in obedience and trust of God. And so we learn that the Israelites, they needed an education. They needed to be schooled in humility, obedience, and trust in God. And so God brings them into Desert University so they can get an education. Desert University. Before they are to experience the abundant life that God has for them in the Promised Land, they're brought out as slaves from Egypt. They're free, but God needs to get them ready to live the abundant life He has for them. And so He brings them to Desert U to learn humility and trust. You see, we learn in this story that the desert isn't so much a geographical place as it is a place on the life map that we all have to go to. The desert places are are littering our lives. There are many seasons when we are brought into these times of trial and these times of testing where God teaches us humility. He teaches us to trust in Him regardless of what the circumstances around us might say. And He teaches us to obey Him even when we can't see. Even when we can't understand where the journey is leading, God is preparing us. He is preparing us. And so the desert is the place between where we used to be and where we want to be. That's our place of the desert. And the Israelites are in this in-between place in their lives. The people have been removed from Egypt, but Egypt has not been removed from them. You see, they still have the remnants of that slave mentality living inside of them. They're worrying, they're concerned. We find in this story about, will God provide for us? Can we really trust God in these places where we can't fully understand what God is doing? You see, God has freed the people, but slavery is still alive in God's people. They are still struggling with who God is calling them to be. And y'all, that's how Israel's journey mirrors our own Christian journeys. Just like them, we can be freed from our old past lives in an instant. Salvation can come to us in a moment, and we can feel that God has set us free, has forgiven our past. And as we begin to walk with Christ, we realize that we got a ways to go. Before our lives start reflecting more of the life of Jesus, there's a lot of work that God needs to do in us. And that's where Desert University comes in. Like the Israelites, we too go through those seasons that test us. We face our own desert places that try our faith, that humble us, that expose our lack of trust in God's provision. You see, the desert didn't create Israel's trusting in God problem. It exposes it. And that's the way our trials and tribulations in our own Christian journeys, isn't that what we discover? Is in those moments just how weak and how broken and how in need of God we are. It reveals that song that we've grown up singing, He's still working on me, making me what I ought to be. You see, the desert places in our lives reveal that God has much work to do in us, that we have much to learn about obedience and fully trusting in God. You see, in these wilderness experiences that we learn in Exodus 15 through 18, there are 5 tests that God gives to them at Desert U. The 5 tests are this. One is the bitter water test we find in Exodus 15. You can see these listed up here. The second test is the hunger test, which we discover in chapter 16. The third test is a retest. They failed the first thirst test, so they're given it again in chapter 17. In chapter 17, in the latter part of the chapter, we find the fourth test, the enemy attacks. The Amalekites, there's enemies living in those desert places, and those enemies attack, and they're tested. Will we trust God to help us fight our battles? And then finally, the last test is the stress test. Moses is wearing that burden of leading God's people, and there's all this anxiety upon him. And he is brought to the place of weakness in his life where he realizes he can't do it. He can't live out the calling that God has on him without trusting more deeply in God. And so over these next 3 weeks, we'll explore 3 of these tests to better learn how God uses these experiences in the journey of the Israelites, and also how God uses these types of experiences in our own Christian journey to teach us the lessons of humility, trust, and obedience. So as we get to this 16th chapter and the hunger test, what we discover is the Israelites are brought into the wilderness on purpose. They're led into the wilderness by God. And how do they respond? Well, we find in that second verse of the chapter we read earlier that the whole congregation of the people of Israel grumbles and complains to Moses and Aaron. They grumble. So here we have God's people. They still have mud between their toes from working in the slave pits in Egypt. They're still wet behind the ears from being led through the greatest miracle of Scripture, the parting of the Red Sea. One of the greatest miracles. And now they are a free people. They have been made free. Their enemies have been defeated, and the glory of God's presence just shines upon them in the cloud and the pillar of fire. And God is just there. He's smiling upon His people. And they're basking in His presence. And they are led into the desert, to Desert University. And it's here where they're going to learn you can't choose what happens to you, but you can choose how you're going to respond. And their response, we learn in the text, is to grumble. They grumble, why? Because they're hungry. They want something to eat. There's no food. They wonder, how is God going to feed us in this wilderness? Will there be enough? Will God provide for me? And so they grumbled, they complained, they moaned and groaned, they griped, they bellyache. And they all get on the Back to Egypt committee. They want to go back to Egypt. They remember, they said, didn't we have it so great back in Egypt? We were able to sit by meat pots and eat our fill, and we had bread. Are they misremembering? They were slaves. They didn't sit by any meat pots. But yet, we see that there are the vestiges of Egypt still in them. They have Egyptian appetites. They want the leeks and the onions and the garlic and the melons and the cucumbers. They have Egyptian appetites. Egypt is still in them, even though they are no longer in Egypt. And so the wilderness, God brings them into it to remind them that their appetites are misplaced. That instead of hungering for the things this world has to offer, instead of trusting in their own provisions, that they need to look to Him and trust in His provision. That God will provide. And so there's a spiritual lesson there for us. When we're spiritually hungry, we can suffer from a case of the grumpies. Y'all know what it means to be hangry? Yeah. So many people, I've got a brother-in-law, and you can tell when he's hungry. He starts belly aching. My wife's sister tells us about it. She says, I can tell when Sean needs to get something to eat. He starts griping and complaining, and he gets angry. And I say, go eat something. Get over your hangriness. And isn't that true for many of us? When we get hungry, we start griping. We start complaining. And you know what? When God's people get spiritually hungry, when they're not being fed and nourished, sometimes we complain. Sometimes we complain. But you know what? God has a cure for the grumpies. You know what it is? It's Wonder Bread. God hears their grumblings. And listen to what He says to them. He says, Moses, I want you to tell the people that I am going to rain bread from heaven. Yeah. Right here in this wilderness, right here in what you think is a God-forsaken place where you don't see any way for God to provide. I want you to tell the people, Moses, that I'll provide. They may not see it right now, but I will provide for you. I'm going to give you wonder bread. The bread that can get us through the hard times. And despite their complaints, their belly aching and their grumbling, God shows them tremendous grace. How great is the love of the Father, that He would lavish upon us His goodness. And that's what they experience right here in the wilderness. God tells them, when you get up in the morning, just go outside your tent and look around. And you will see what the Lord will provide. And sure enough, they get up in the morning and they go out, and what do they see? They see manna. They see this white flaky stuff all over the ground, and they're told to gather up enough for a day. Don't gather too much, don't gather too little. It'll be just enough. It'll get you through the day. And before you go to bed in the evening hours, I'm going to send some quail, God says. Manna in the morning, quail in the evening. I'm going to give you quail and biscuits. What a fine meal. We had a member of the church share with many of us staff a meal of quail and biscuits a few weeks ago. Fantastic meal. And that's what God provides for His children. Right here in the wilderness, quail and biscuits. They go out and they look at this stuff. They've never seen it before. And they ask, what is it? What is this stuff? This bread from heaven, this wonder bread, what is it? And they said, yeah, that's what it is. What? What is it? That's what manna means in Hebrew. Man who? What is it? And so they're stuffing their mouths and they're getting filled off of what God provides, and they're saying, man, I don't know what this stuff is, but it's great. It tastes like bread with honey on it. It's so sweet. It's so good. Isn't God good? God will provide. Yes, He will. Amen. And they fill enough. They fill their stomachs with enough to get through a day. Every morning and every evening, God provides for His children daily bread, daily sustenance. And it was enough to get them through another day. Every day, the Lord was teaching them a lesson. At Desert U, He's teaching them to trust in Him. He's teaching them to trust in His power to provide, in His strength to sustain, in His daily bread. The question is, will they learn the lesson? The test for Israel and the test for us in this story is, will I trust God for my daily bread? Will I trust God in the midst of what may seem like to me a wilderness experience? Will I trust God to provide for me, to open doors for me, to provide opportunities for me? Will I trust God to give me strength through it? Will I trust in His daily provision? Jesus taught us to pray. He taught His disciples to pray. How did He teach them to pray? Lord, give us this day our daily bread. This is what Jesus teaches His followers. This is what the children of Israel are learning at Desert U. Only those who absolutely trust God to provide for them would eat their portion that would just get them through that day, lie down at night, with a heart full of peace, knowing that God had fed them that day, and He would feed them the next day as well. A step at a time. Day by day, the Lord leads them on this journey. Their bodies are fed, but even more so, their faith is strengthened. God will provide. And y'all, just as Israel needed faith to get out of Egypt, they would need to live by faith every day. Paul in Romans 1:7 says, "The just shall live by faith." And so the desert is the place where God removes everything that we have depended on, so that we can learn to trust that He alone is enough. I want to conclude with a story back from the Hanoi Hilton. I told you I wanted to share with you a story about Red McDaniel. On May the 19th, 1967, Red was flying an A-6 jet over North Vietnam. He was shot, and he had to eject from his plane, and his parachute opened and he descended down into the top of a tree. He writes about his experience in Scars and Stripes, kind of a memoir of his experiences. And he says, while I was hanging in that tree, I prayed. I expected a quick rescue. He said, I prayed for deliverance, noting that when I stopped to think about it, I couldn't remember when I had prayed for anything that crucial before.